Hello there, John Cuturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining us for this episode. As usual, thank you to everybody who makes this work possible. And also, as usual, if you have concerns about yourself or somebody else, please never take what you find on the internet or in the media as advice. Seek advice from a professional or somebody else that you trust. If you are in Australia and are seeking counselling from me, you can find my details in the description of this episode. And in today's episode, it is my pleasure to welcome my guest, Dr. Diana Harman, coming to us from the United States. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, John.
Doctor, tell us about what you do.
Yeah, so I actually live in New York. I am a therapist. I got my degree in mental health counseling. So that's what started this journey. And I work with clients both in private practice, and I work part-time in a clinic, working with individuals that have anxiety, OCD, depression, ADHD, learning disabilities, things like that. Basically, anyone that has a nervous system that is dysregulated, that is my jam. And when I'm not doing that, I also have done a lot of research on transgenerational trauma, specifically around grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, as well as therapeutic engagement in the Orthodox Jewish community. So, and advocacy work, of course, which I think we're all doing a little bit of.
It's excellent. For anyone who wants to contact Dr. Harman, her details will be in the description of this episode. Now, in today's episode, we're going to be discussing the juxtaposition between the private life and the public life or the professional life of a therapist. And this issue has come to light for me, and it's something that I've discussed previously, but I'm always fascinated to hear different perspectives on these subjects. I intuit that there is a misconception in our society that psychotherapists are what we might call a blank slate, someone who presents as having no opinions or particular evaluations about life, people who remain neutral on every conceivable subject except for mental health and simply advocating for mental health and not having any other involvement in public life or not having any other involvement in culture. And this is something of a dangerous assumption and supposition to maintain for reasons that we'll discuss today. But Dr. Harman, I understand that you have discussed quite extensively in your own media how your personal self and your professional self sit alongside each other. What have you discussed and what have you found to start us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very interesting topic, especially because when we're being educated, I don't know about in Australia, but I know in the United States, the big piece is that we should be a blank slate and that it goes against ethical practice in order to share who you are. But what I found in the room and as well as in research is that it's really hard to be a blank slate because we're people and we have our own feelings, our own thoughts, our own opinions. And I think there is a place to share your own opinions, which is why on my Instagram, I definitely share my opinions about my struggles that I've had, in school and getting through it and being resilient, things that people can connect to.
Absolutely. That speaks to something that is very much an elephant in the room, that regardless of how qualified one is, we are still human beings. That is who we are at our core. We cannot be anything without that factor being acknowledged, that we're human beings. And even though we are qualified human beings and we serve a role to help people in particularly vulnerable states that requires us to be professionally quite resilient and quite stoic at times, quite emotionally regulated, I don't believe for a second that any person who seeks therapy wants to seek it from a professional who does not have a confident sense of self and is not a human first and foremost. Because I've seen the effects of being a blank slate. I've seen therapists myself. I've been very candid about my history of mental illness. I've seen therapists myself, and I've known other clients and other people in my personal life who have seen therapists who do present as the blank slate, not emotionally expressive at all, not having any sense of character or being able to relate to what it is that we're telling them. And the therapeutic outcomes from what I've seen are not positive. And the research is quite unambiguous that the key factor in determining whether any therapeutic method is actually effective is how well the therapist can connect with the client in order to deliver it. That's the basis of it. If you can't connect with the client, all the technicalities in the world cannot solve any problems. So I find it quite perplexing. Well, to be fair, actually, I don't find it perplexing because I know how the world tends to think. They tend to be quite literal minded and think this good, this bad, without any acknowledgement of the nuances. And you're absolutely right that people do want to see a human being first and foremost. Otherwise, how can one possibly trust that you can help them with their problems if you don't give the impression that you're a human who could have those same problems and understand them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think also back to my academic background for sure. And because I spent so many years with it. And this has been a conversation that has come up, especially with being on social media. And there were some of my classmates who were like, I wouldn't see a therapist who was on social media. But then at the same time, the world is changing, right? So how do we kind of juggle that? And I think one of my mentors kind of said it best, that they have to teach us good or bad in the beginning of our education, so then we can actually learn how to be clinical and learn how to trust our gut. And then as you go through the program, so maybe in your second year, and as you become a therapist, you start to learn, okay, when is it appropriate for me to be in the room and maybe share something that's personal to me? And when is it not? And I think the biggest, importantest thing to remember when you are sharing is, who's this benefiting? Is this benefiting me? Is it benefiting the client? Do I just want to kind of just share it? And having that as an important guide when you're sharing.
Absolutely. That's an important delineation, and this would be an excellent place for us to start, because there does need to be separation between one's personal self and one's professional self. People define it differently. I've had some industry colleagues say that counseling to a certain extent is performative, in the sense that the person that you are in the room, while it's not completely alien to the person that you are authentically, you are presenting a particular persona, not to be dishonest, but more because that's what the client needs in the room. It's a particular emotional presentation and a particular type of communication that is specifically designed to help the client feel at ease and activate the client's mental resources so that they can engage in the therapeutic process. So to a large extent, that is necessary. Without that, the client can't gain any benefit therapeutically. And you're right that at the same time, there are times in which it is useful to share something personal about yourself with your clients, because it does have benefits to them. Some examples that come to mind is, recently I was actually working with a client who was in the professional arts industry, and there are times when I will share facts about myself very strategically in the therapeutic process, because it shows the client that I actually am taking notice of who they are as a person, and that I'm a human first and foremost, so they don't feel like they're just talking to a brick wall, they're talking to a human being. And so I shared with them, as it happens, I was a photographer earlier in my life, so they know that they're talking to a human being and not just someone who's passively listening. I'm taking notice of the details. Some clients might have some reservations about crying in therapy, and letting out emotions in therapy in that way is actually quite healthy, because you may feel you can't do it any place else. So that's a safe environment to do it. And I might reveal, well, I've cried in therapy before. I'm not ashamed of it, but it shows the client, if I, as a professional who is now perceived to be in authority here, can admit that I'm not perfect, it's okay for you to not be perfect either. You don't have to be perfect to be a good person.
Yeah, I also think it's really important that when you are sharing something, I kind of ask the client permission. I don't just go, okay, I'm just going to share, like if I am sharing something extremely personal, it's more I've shared with clients who, let's say they're learning how to play the guitar and I play guitar. So I would say to them like, oh, what are you learning? Like, what's your favorite song? Oh, this is my favorite song, just to connect, especially early on in the therapeutic alliance, especially when you're working, I find, with teens or people who have it's their first experience in therapy. So they don't know exactly what to expect. So they're expecting you to, from what they see on TV, which is blank slate. They're sitting, lying on a couch, and therapy's nothing like that in this day and age. And usually when people come in to my office, they're kind of expecting something like that, or, me to be like, oh, this is your problem. And that doesn't happen. And so they get really confused that I bring in our relationship. I always say our relationship in the room is the most important relationship for the work, because whatever is happening in the room is a mirror to what is happening on the outside of the room.
Absolutely, and that's a good point about asking permission to share something if it is going to be an elongated description beyond a few seconds, or that it's going to be particularly confronting emotionally, potentially, just to ensure that the care is trauma informed and the client knows in advance, just in case it might potentially make them feel uncomfortable. But at the same time, the gesture shows that you are thinking of the client and paying attention to the details that they're communicating, both explicitly and by implication. I want to talk about involvement in public life, because this is something that is quite important. Perhaps it's a controversial evaluation, but my evaluation is that a good therapist is not simply a therapist, first and foremost. A good therapist has to know how the world works, because we're working with people and people constitute the world. We make the world work in any aspect of humanity. People make the world work. It relies on us. So for us to understand an individual, we have to understand how individuals work individually and within themselves and with other people. I believe it is quite naive for the establishment and for academia to think that it is a violation of professional boundaries for us to not be involved in public life. It's not to say that you have to, no one is obliged to, but for the therapists that want to be involved in public life, it shouldn't be discouraged, because many of the problems, in fact, I would argue most of the problems for which people seek counselling have some grounding in some way in the workings of society. Whether systemic arguments are accurate or not is a completely different issue. I won't take a tangent there, but in some way they tend to be related in some ways to the working of society, or at least how the person relates to other people. Largely, these problems can be also associated with negative or unhelpful habits that we tend to have, or negative establishments that we've created over time, social norms and so forth. For us to simply talk about individual problems with clients in isolation is to ignore all those external problems and all of the potential wisdom that we can share with the world about how they can also solve their own problems, and not simply wait until a problem becomes so serious for them that they have to seek individual help.
Yeah, I definitely think that when we are sharing publicly, I think we have to do it in a way that obviously makes sense. We shouldn't be sharing everything, and we do need to take into account that we are seen in a way to higher standards. As much as we try to make ourselves human and people, it's not something that we can change, as much as I would love to change that. But at the same time, I think it is important for us to be able to share and have a public persona as well. I think that's why it's so important. I love going to conferences. I love working on Instagram and being able to share this information to people that need it. And also that's a big part of taking away that stigma from the mental health field. If we're not going to be public about it, then how do we expect the rest of the world to work with it?
That's an excellent way of describing it. And you're absolutely right that we are perceived as being held to high standards, but often I wonder who actually maintains that impression. Is it our clientele, or is it members of the industry and the establishment? Because oftentimes the media and society in general, we tend to develop these ideas about what people generally believe, or sometimes we refer to concepts like the silent majority. This is what most people believe, but no one says. But then all too often that's based on what somebody has convinced us is the case, or what we want to believe is the case. So I sometimes wonder, who is it that's maintaining that idea that we must be held to higher standards? My intuition, I could be completely wrong, but my intuition is that if you ask most clients who potentially could seek therapy, what they want is somebody who is willing to be honest and is personable first and foremost. I get the impression that perhaps a lot of the idea that we need to be elite in some way is more maintained by the establishment who benefits from that impression, but perhaps I'm wrong. But my general experience with clients is they want to be with a human being first and foremost. Obviously, they don't want to be with a human being that is indiscriminate. They want to be with somebody who is well-regulated and considerate and thoughtful. But at the same time, one can address difficult subjects and still be discriminating and thoughtful.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, John. I mean, I wonder, I think it's a mixed. I think that there is a piece of it of, the mental health field as a whole, right? We have these different ideas and these different definitions, but at the same time, then when I'm meeting with clients there are clients who don't really want to know that we're people at the same time. They like to be able to have that imagination of, oh, my therapist doesn't have any problems. My therapist lives a wonderful life. And they'll bring that into the room where they'll be like, oh, well, you don't know what it's like to have anxiety. And I'm like, how do you know that? Can we talk about that? Of how do you know that I've never experienced anxiety or I've never struggled with my confidence? You don't. And the thing is, for them, they want to be able to kind of bring up their own, in a way, like transference of what they want to believe and what they want to look like in the world. Well, if my therapist can be completely resilient and nothing can stop them, then maybe I can be. But if my therapist is vulnerable and my therapist is a person that has went through struggles, well, then maybe that's just it. Maybe we all go through struggles. And that's a really hard thing to look at as a person.
As a counsellor, I receive referrals from others, and I also like to help my audience become aware of resources and other providers which may be beneficial, as well as help other individuals and organisations gain exposure. That's why I host the Your Listener Partner Network, and I'd like to thank my partners for their support. I'd like to introduce Jibeli Positive Pathways. Jibeli Positive Pathways is an NDIS registered provider specialising exclusively in positive behaviour support. They support children, young people and adults with disability who experience behaviours of concern, using evidence-based, person-centred and trauma-informed approaches. Their work focuses on understanding the functions of behaviour, reducing restrictive practices, and building meaningful skills and improving quality of life. They collaborate closely with families, support workers, schools, and services to ensure strategies are practical, consistent, and sustainable across everyday settings. Find them at www.jibelipositivepathways.com.au. You've raised another excellent point that I think deserves further exploration, because people have an idea in mind that they like to believe, and often what we like to believe is not necessarily based on what we prefer or what is necessarily good for us, but what is familiar. Familiarity is a great sense of comfort to us, even if the source of the familiarity is not comfortable. To give an example, one of the driving forces of human behavior and motivation is the implicit knowledge that life is dangerous and that one day we're all going to die. We all have that instinct. We all implicitly know that. And a lot of our motivation is through self-pacification, to try and distract ourselves from that. And so if a client brings the idea to therapy that you don't know what it's like to be anxious or to have complex trauma, for example, you must be perfect. That implicit belief could have a number of meanings. It could derive from a number of sources. It could be wishful thinking, hoping there is somebody in the world who is perfect to whom I can aspire to be. It could be hoping that this person can help me and that in order to help me, they need to be perfect. There may be a number of reasons that they bring that assumption. In fact, almost in every case, if a person has that assumption, in the therapeutic environment, it's necessary to eventually challenge that notion, because a number of dangers can happen if a person believes that anything less than being perfect and problem-free is not acceptable. Number one, it's going to perpetuate the problem, because every time that person stumbles, they're going to think quite lowly of themselves and they're not going to acknowledge the good that they're doing. The other problem is that if we allow that illusion to continue, it could result in pathologization, whereby we see every problem that a person experiences, even if it's a normal part of the human experience, as being an illness that needs to be fixed, quote unquote. So I've actually had this conversation with industry colleagues before, and even supervisors, where they've told me that I've been discussing cases that I've seen, for example, with my clients, and explained that if I encountered the case again, I would want to take it slightly differently, because I could have done some more to challenge the client's misconceptions and actually help them develop healthier habits. And the response I got was, but the client got what they wanted out of the therapeutic encounter. But my response is always, yes, but did they get what they needed? A client may want to believe that the world can be a perfect place, but that assumption is never going to be healthy. So I think it deserves to be pondered, at least, that some clients do want to believe, yes, my therapist is completely perfect, but then if you can show them the alternative, the reality in a sensitive way, in an appropriate way, what they'll then start to realize was, okay, it probably wasn't reasonable for me to think that life can be perfect, but it also isn't reasonable for me to think that I can't be a good person if I'm not perfect. I can be human and a good person and still have my flaws. And at the same time, it's not an illness to have flaws. A lot of people think that the slightest grievance with one's mental health constitutes an illness, but that's not the case.
Yeah, I also think that, especially with, you were saying that idea of wanting to be perfect, and you said, well, is it what they needed instead of what they wanted? And I think there's one big distinction that we're missing there is, are they ready for that? Right? Because if a client isn't ready to hear that, you can completely shut them down, and they might just not get what they wanted from that relationship as well. So I think it is important to challenge it, of course, but also listening to your gut, your clinical gut there, and being like, do I think that the person is ready to hear this, or do I think that it will, be completely shut down? And there are clients that are ready to hear it, where, I'm thinking of a client where we were talking about challenges in school. And that's something I'm very familiar with. I struggled my whole life in academia until I hit college. And then once I hit college, I started to become who I am, and really, be able to challenge some of those conceptions of like who I was and who I'm supposed to be. And this client was telling me, he's like, it's so embarrassing, it's so shameful. And there were points where I was like, I feel like this might be a good time to bring this in. And I'm like, I don't think he's ready yet. Until one day, all of a sudden, like the inside of me, I was like, wait a minute. I think he's like, today's the day. We were having the conversation, and he was ready to hear that. But I think if I would have done it any earlier, I don't think it would have been helpful. I think it may have been harmful for him, and it may have caused him to completely rupture the relationship. I think the therapy relationship, as much as we don't like to think about it in this ways, because it goes back to, Freud and the early on, is the idea that the therapy relationship is kind of like a parental relationship in a way, right? Where we tend to think of parents as perfect. Growing up, parents can't make mistakes. Adults don't make mistakes. And so we tend to carry on that infantile idea that, like, my therapist is kind of like my parent in that way of, like, they don't make mistakes. And, I think if you tell a child or a teen, like, your parent makes mistakes, they're not ready to hear that yet, right? It takes time for them to go on their own journey and realize, wait a minute, like, people are actually human beings and it's okay for them to make mistakes. So, back to the idea of, like, are they ready is the big question.
Absolutely. The therapeutic material has to be presented at the right time, and that has to be very finely discerned for each individual client. The brain doesn't respond the same in every possible environment, and for it to be optimal, we effectively need to prime the brain to be ready to receive certain ideas. And once it's ready, it will respond in a far more constructive and more evenly regulated fashion. Something I want to raise is that's been of particular interest to me as well is the idea of social critique, and this is very important. Again, my conceptualization is that for one to be a therapist, one has to have some evaluations about how the world works. I think that we need to be willing to acknowledge both the good and the bad in the world. All too often, we are given this stereotype that therapists must be always positive, and again are a blank slate. A blank slate has no negativity or no positivity; they're completely neutral. I spent much of my life that way, and now later in life, as a therapist, I've taken not the opposite approach, but I'm a lot more balanced. I find it quite helpful to be someone who acknowledges both the good and the bad in the world. And in the work that I produce in my media content, in my writing, I'm constantly acknowledging the good and the bad, and not trying to sugarcoat life, or not trying to give the impression that everything is rosy. Because I know there are plenty of people out there who are suffering, and plenty of people who are trying their best to make the most of life and are perhaps not having the success that they want. I think it would be rather short-sighted to simply say one must always be positive, otherwise they're giving the wrong impression, or they're giving a negative impression. I think we need to come to grips with something as a society, that we have flaws. Like, society is a flawed phenomenon. We have to be willing to acknowledge that. And if we actually want to make changes, we can't simply be positive all the time and sugarcoat everything and assume that if we just be positive about everything, things will change. We have to be willing to face some pretty difficult facts. We have to be willing to acknowledge that there are problems, and we have to be willing to get our hands dirty to actually solve them. I'd say that, again, the paradigm of being a blank slate and being positive runs completely contradictory to that. Because if we don't face our problems, how are we going to solve them?
I think that this really connects to the idea of radical acceptance, which is probably one of my favorite tools, but one of the hardest tools to use, I think, for my clients and myself as well, because I'm a human being and it's hard to connect to that. But radical acceptance is the idea that recognizing and identifying that this is hard and that maybe this can't be changed at this very moment. And by accepting that, we're able to accept the idea that, yes, maybe this can change in the future, even though right now it can't. Right? I'm always saying to my clients, I'm like, let's replace the but with and all the time. And I'm trying it in my life as well of, yes, this is true. And what else can be true at the same time? Because if we're just living in that world of, like, it's either this or it's this, it's black or it's white. No, there's so many colors there that we haven't really recognized. There's so many different ways to frame that. And, again, I think it also comes down to being able to recognize that, and if the person's ready to recognize that of, okay, the world has many colors. We can have this frame or that frame, or maybe I'm not ready to frame it that way. Maybe I'm not ready to accept that right now, and that's okay. think that's an important idea that we're all forgetting is like, it's okay if you're thinking black and white right now. I think the first part of that is being able to identify that you're doing it. And that's acceptance in its own light.
That was wonderfully worded. I completely agree. What I also want to address is the idea of influence, the idea of the influence that one can have on the public as a person in a position of authority, especially somebody as a therapist in our cases. Again, this is something I've addressed. It's always warrants discussion. There's a difference between taking responsibility for what we say and responsibility for how people interpret it. Now, there is such thing as what we call dog whistling, where people say something in a particular manner that on a literal level seems quite benign, but is designed and delivered in such a way, formulated and delivered in such a way as to speak to particular nefarious desires of certain groups. People call that dog whistle politics. We have to understand that sometimes we need to discuss difficult subjects in the public eye in order to make people aware of them and in order to encourage the settling of them. One of the biggest problems is that today, in fact, in any period in history, this has been an issue, and what's changed has been the subjects which have been vulnerable to this issue. But the issue has always been that we've always been very avoidant as a species. We always want to avoid the things that make us uncomfortable because we have this implicit belief that if we avoid things, they will disappear and we don't have to face the anxiety of their reality. But in avoiding things doesn't make them disappear. It only makes us more vulnerable to them because we refuse to actually do anything with them. And I've had this conversation with people before whereby people have said, you have to be careful what you say because people might get triggered by it or they might take it the wrong way. I've heard this said at professional conferences as well. And I think, yes, there's certainly merit to that. We have to be careful not to say anything that is outrageously foolish. But what we also have to be careful of is to not be too self-censorious. Because if we're self-censorious, then what we are then reinforcing is the idea that these ideas should never be discussed. We can't discuss this. It's bad. Like, you're reinforcing the narrative. These ideas are bad. And if something is bad, then we should avoid dealing with them. But a problem is always going to exist until someone solves it. And so talking about things like problems in the mental health system, problems in our public health system, problems with certain political ideas, certain economic ideas, suicide, self-harm, problems in our diagnostic systems, all of these areas of life, these important areas of public life, they have problems, and we have to be willing to, I think every person should get involved in the conversation, not just therapists, but every person who is willing to have a public conversation should be involved, and we should encourage each other to be involved in this. But the current narrative doesn't support that, I don't think. It supports certain people with certain credentials having the conversation and everybody else just bowing down and obeying it. And I've turned that on its head multiple times and said, no, I don't think we should do that at all. We should be all involved. We're all a part of the world. And at the same time, we also have to take responsibility for how we take things. So at the start of this episode, at the start of every episode, I always say, and it should be clear, if you are suffering, stop listening to podcasts and reading popular bloggers. Like, get off the internet and go seek advice from someone who's actually accountable to you. You, even as a person who's suffering, you need to take care of yourself. And you need to realize that what's on the internet is there for general discussion purposes. It's not there as advice, and even the people who say it's for advisory purposes are not telling you the truth. Get yourself someone you love, a family member who you trust, a friend, a professional. Get yourself proper guidance and care from someone who is accountable to you. Get off the internet or out of magazines or newspapers. They're not the place to seek advice. But we have to be willing to discuss things even if they are difficult, because censorship throughout history has never solved problems. We have to be willing to accept there are problems, they're difficult to discuss, and we all have a responsibility to approach them thoughtfully, and I think we should all encourage each other to talk about them, not just avoid them for the discomfort.
Yeah, I think in the past couple of years, the idea of being politically correct has been the big idea, right? Where we don't want to say anything that will be harmful, or we'll get canceled if we say something that someone doesn't agree with, right? I think, especially when it comes to politics and different issues, right, there are two sides of different stories. And I think sometimes there are sides that aren't willing to hear what the other people have to say. And so I do encourage people, yes, you should have a conversation, but having a conversation respectfully, right? Respectfully of all sides. And just being careful of how we're saying it as much as we can, right? And then there are other things that just kind of happen, right? That you can't necessarily control, right? You can say your point of view. People may disagree with it, but the important piece is for you to be okay with what you're saying, right? For you to be like, I'm standing for my values, right? I am standing for what I believe is important in society. And if people disagree with that, right, also understanding that that's kind of the media. It's a media piece. The media really controls a lot of the narrative. And so we never get the full side of the story. You know, I met someone yesterday and we were just having this conversation where he was like, you know, he came from Iran and he was talking about that. People were saying all these beliefs of what they believed, what was going in Iran, what do Iranians believe, all everything. And he's like, but none of that's true. And they're like, but what do you mean? The media? And he goes, the media wants you to believe that. That's what they want you to believe. And that's with not only politics, that's with every single issue and every single, even mental health topics, right? You know, they have like the different popular topics that jump up at certain points and then it will go down. And, you know, so I think it's important, and I speak to a lot of people about this, right? Of like, how much media are you taking in? And how much are you allowing it in? And how much are you allowing it to impact your life? If it's impacting your life so much, it's time to get off of the internet and take maybe a little bit of a detox break. It doesn't have to be long. Maybe it's a day or two just to actually see what's going on in your world. Because the internet can be an amazing place, right? It can be a very helpful place, but it could also be a very harmful place. It all depends how you're using it, how much you're using it, and, you know, all the different ways.
I understand you're a part of the Jewish community, and the Jewish community has come under a lot of controversy recently for various different issues. The controversy around what's happening in the Middle East at the moment has caused a lot of division, and what it also causes people to do is to preempt what somebody else's beliefs might be based on surface level statements. Recently in Australia down here, we had the Bondi attack. Okay, on Bondi Beach, a number of Jewish individuals were murdered in public by some individuals whom I believe that the media claim that they were Islamic radicals, but whether or not that's actually the case, I'm not going to state here unless in case that it was not an accurate description. But that's what was presented to the public. Regardless of whether you agree with what is happening in the Middle East or not, regardless of whether you agree with Judaism or whether you agree with Islam or whether you agree with Christianity or whether you agree with what Israel is doing or whether you disagree with that, randomly murdering a number of people in a public space is not going to solve whatever problems may exist. You're murdering someone who's completely innocent. Just because we acknowledge that fact, it doesn't mean we also can't acknowledge perhaps that you may not agree with what's happening in Israel. You don't have to agree with it. But the fact is that nowhere in history has what happened in Bondi Beach ever solved problems. If you want to solve problems, you have to be willing to do it in an intelligent manner. There's a lot about world politics that I don't know. That's why I don't comment on it, because I don't have the empirical knowledge to actually make accurate statements about it. And another thing I always say is, unless you've actually been to a country, be careful about commenting on it, because often what the media tells you about it is completely wrong, as you just said. So I'm reluctant to believe what the media says on face value. I don't want to make false statements about somebody else. I will make statements about things with which I have direct experience, or things that are evident, demonstrable, it's like self-evident. So I'm not going to comment on how to run a war or how to solve the war in the Middle East or how to solve world affairs, because I'm not qualified or adequately experienced to be able to make that judgment. I can say, though, that you're never going to solve problems by randomly murdering individuals whom you assume you disagree with. If that makes me controversial as a person, I quite frankly don't care, because if I can't state something that is blatantly obvious in aid of understanding how the world works and encouraging people to have better mental habits, which is my business, to teach people how to be better users of their mind and have more healthy behaviors, which includes not killing people at random, then what can you say? It doesn't matter who says it or what side it's from. I'm not interested in taking sides. Certain things are just facts. If we want a better world, we have to be willing to say that certain things are bad, and murdering people is a bad thing to do.
I definitely agree with that. I mean, after October 7th, the world really did change for Jewish people as a whole. Everywhere, anti-Semitism has become a lot more intense. People are getting hurt. People are getting murdered. People are, there are a lot more terrorist attacks. And that's terrifying, just for having a religious belief. People like to have those opinions of, well, this is what this means, or that's what that means. I think part of anti-Semitism is even having the belief of, well, you're Jewish, that must mean that you control what goes on in Israel, right? You can have family that lives in Israel, doesn't mean you control. I have zero control over what happens in Israel. Have I been there? Yes. Do I have family there? Yes. Is that a part of me? It is, but does that mean that I deserve not to have a place in this world? I don't think so. I think murder is bad on all sides, and I think there are a lot of people that do believe that the world seems to kind of shut out, right? With the Bondi attack, that kind of was glossed over in the media. And comments that I kind of saw as a Jewish person was like, well, they deserved it. They're Jewish. I've had colleagues that have said that to me, and they're like, well, and I'm like, you can't be in the mental health space and make such statements. Murder should be bad, period. Done. End of conversation. That's just it. We don't murder people just because they're walking in the street and they're going to pray. Like, that's not okay. I wouldn't say that's okay for if it was a Muslim or any other group. I don't think it's okay for anyone. I believe in freedom of speech. I believe that, freedom of religion, just like everybody else. And I think it's an important piece, and it definitely impacts also the mental health world, where people that have any kind of that impact or are Jewish are kind of being excluded now from the mental health world because they don't want to hear that, because they think, well, that means Israel and that means you control what goes on there, and they don't want to be canceled.
Well, Dr. Harman, this has been a fantastic discussion with many insightful ideas exchanged. Thank you so much for being on the show today. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, John. It's been a pleasure, and maybe we could do this again.
Absolutely. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us today. If you have concerns about yourself or somebody else, please seek advice from a professional or somebody else that you trust. Never take what you find on the internet or in the media as advice. If you are in Australia and are seeking counselling from me, you can find my details in the description of this episode. You will also find links to Dr. Harman's work in the description of this episode as well. And if you have feedback on the program or you'd like to be a guest, please contact me. I love to hear from my audience. And until next time, take care.